It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda, which is item 1 and 2. Does any committee member wish to remove an item for a separate discussion from the consent agenda? I don't believe I see any hands. Hearing none, is there any objection to the approval of the consent agenda? So hearing no objections, the consent agenda is approved. We do have one discussion item on today's agenda, which is item 3, and it is an information item regarding the audited financial statements and the single audit report. The item was amended to include the audited financial statements and single audit report, and copies of these have been provided to the trustees and also publicly posted online at the Board of Trustees meeting agenda webpage. As an introduction to this item, on behalf of the board, I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize the dedicated CSU staff across the system who compiled and consolidated the financial information for this agenda. It is not an exaggeration to say that this was a Herculean task. There is a lot of documents and financial records to compile and to pull together into one place. And to do so with, as you'll hear in the report, no exceptions is a phenomenal accomplishment. So I'd like to thank all of the CSU accounting professionals and leaders for your commitment to this effort. Today's item will be presented by Steve Relier, our Executive Vice Chancellor and CFO, joined by Mary Eck, the Assistant Vice Chancellor and Controller, and also joined by Chris Ray, our KPMG audit partner. With that, Steve, would you please begin?
Thank you, Trustee Day. So each year we present the CSU financial statements, the single audit report, and results of our annual external audit performed by KPMG. And the financial statements are published on our CSU Financial Transparency website, and as Trustee Day mentioned, have been included as part of your agenda material. This information will be presented by Mary Eck, the Assistant Vice Chancellor and Controller, and our KPMG audit partner, Chris Ray. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Thank you, Executive Vice Chancellor Relier. Before I begin with the details of the financial statements, I would like to take a moment to highlight the process involved with consolidation, resulting in this final product. The CSU is required to consolidate all 23 campuses and the Chancellor's office into this comprehensive report. In the financial report, you'll notice we also incorporate the 91 component units, which are primarily the auxiliaries. As you might imagine, in any year, this would be a difficult task. Working remotely during the pandemic underscored the importance of our ongoing efforts to automate data collection, which successfully resulted in a clean audit. And now let's review the data. This slide provides a summary of the revenues for fiscal year 2019-20. Total revenues from all sources, such as operating, non-operating, capital, and non-capital, were $10.3 billion for the fiscal year. The $10 billion in revenues covers all of our CSU operations, which includes more than the $7 billion operating budget that you normally see Ryan Storm discuss in his budget presentations. As shown on the chart, the breakout of total revenues, similar to the prior year's fiscal year's distribution, shows the largest source was state appropriations at approximately 46%, while net tuition and fees represents approximately 21% of total revenues. Grants, contracts, and gifts represents approximately 24% of the total. This was made up primarily of Pell Grants, Cal Grants, and middle-class scholarships. The $10 billion total represents an increase in revenue of $749 million from the previous year. This includes a $602 million increase in the general fund appropriation, $325 million increase in grants, contracts, and gifts, which includes student grants of $242 million from the CARES Act. These were offset by a $112 million reduction in revenues from sales and services due to the pandemic. As shown on the previous slide, net tuition or fees represents approximately 21% of the total revenue. The $4 billion in 2019-20 on the chart represents the gross tuition and fees that we collect. as you're aware, the CSU places a very high priority on all types of student financial aid, including federal, state, and institutional support, which is reflected in the net $2.18 billion on the chart. This financial aid covers the gap to assist students with achieving their educational goals. The gross student tuition and fee revenue reflected has remained stable over the last 3 years. The slightly increasing gap between the gross tuition and fees in blue and the net tuition in red reflects growth in the waivers and financial aid grants made available to eligible students. This slide provides a summary of expenses for the fiscal year. The total expenses of $10.8 billion, about 70% of which is instructional and educational support, represents an increase of $830 million from the previous year. This increase is primarily due to higher costs for pensions, scholarship and fellowship, and salaries. This slide provides a summary of net position by category for fiscal year 1920. Net position is often a useful indicator of the university's financial position and represents the residual assets over liabilities. For the CSU, you may recall that government entities are required to report long-term post-employment and pension benefit obligations. The reporting of these long-term obligations began in fiscal year 2018 and 2015, respectively. These are reflected in the unrestricted net position, as shown on the chart, of a negative $22.2 billion. The unrestricted net position also includes $3.4 billion for purposes such as housing, parking, student activities, and operations. Total negative net position of $15 billion increased by $486 million from the prior year. Despite this negative $15 billion net position, the university's ability to pay our obligations remains positive. This slide is included as a reminder regarding the operating fund reserves and designated balances that were presented to the board at the September 2020 meeting. As of June 30, 2020, total reserves and balances in the operating fund totaled $1.7 billion. Reserves for economic uncertainties were $400 million, which represents less than 1 month of operating fund costs. And this does not yet include CARES Act funding or substantial impacts to reserves due to the pandemic. The available one-time reserves will continue to be used by campuses to help with revenue losses and unavoidable operating costs due to the pandemic. For the system-wide audit, KPMG did not identify any audit findings. The previous significant deficiency related to the accuracy of the OPEB liability was remediated. Each auxiliary organization also conducts their own audits. Of the 91 auxiliaries, 9 had a mix of material weaknesses and significant deficiencies. A material weakness is noted as a deficiency in internal control over financial reporting, and a significant deficiency indicates an issue that is less severe. We are following up with each organization's board of directors to ensure appropriate corrective actions are taken. Additionally, as required by the Office of Management and Budget, we conduct a separate audit on the federal funds received. This included approximately $245 million in CARES grants. There were no findings on the CARES Act funds. The 2 findings noted were of minor financial materiality, however, they're required to be reported. System-wide, there was 1 repeat audit finding related to the reporting of enrollment status and ensuring that effective controls are in place for timely and accurate reporting of student enrollment status changes. Another audit finding is related to timely disbursement notification and ensuring the required disbursement information is communicated to the student or parent within the required time frame. Corrective actions for these items are in progress, and a status update will be provided at a future board meeting. While we continue to monitor the progress of our long-term liabilities, the CSU remains in sound financial condition with regard to annual and short-term obligations. This is further supported by KPMG's unmodified opinion of our audited financial statements. As I mentioned previously, the effort put forth by all the financial reporting staff at the campuses and auxiliaries to accurately report and consolidate into this final product was exceptional. The work from home environment provided some unique challenges that the teams found ways to overcome. In addition to their normal activity, the campuses were able to accurately report on CARES Act student disbursements, while the Chancellor's Office staff and our HR colleagues managed to work through the challenges of the OPEB reporting to remediate our previous finding and publish a clean audit. Thanks to everyone for staying focused and getting to the finish line. At this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Chris Ray, our KPMG audit partner, for further comment. Both Chris and I are happy to answer any questions following his remarks. Chris?
Thanks, Mary. I'd like to go through a few prepared remarks just related to the results of the audit. We've previously met with the Committee on Audit and discussed the required communications that are required at the end of every audit. But today I'd like to just highlight a few of those matters for you. One, just to remind you of the scope of the work we did. As Mary alluded to, we were engaged to audit the June 30 financial statements of the California State University system, which included 91 component units. The audit is a significant effort, as it's been noted earlier in the discussions, which involved numerous people within the CSU, numerous people within KPMG, and over 15 different accounting firms across the state. Due to the global pandemic, this was the first time that we ever performed a virtual financial statement and single audit. And this audit couldn't have been done without all of the commitment and help of the CSU Chancellor's Office team, as well as all of the campuses. So we really appreciate that to be able to get us to a point where we could actually issue the opinion. As it relates to the structure and planning of the audit, there were no significant changes in the plan structure that we had related to the audit. We also performed our audit in accordance with the auditing standards generally accepted in the United States to be able to put us in a position at the end of the audit to issue an opinion. And as Mary alluded to, we issued an unmodified opinion on the financial statements for this year. A couple of other things related to the audit, just from the significant accounting policies of the university. There weren't any significant changes this year. There was one additional footnote added just related to the uncertainties related to COVID and the global pandemic that we still find ourselves in. So, but everything else is consistent from the previous year. There are certain judgments and estimates that are included in the financial statements. Some of those have been referenced earlier related to OPEB, pension, valuation of investments. So those were considered as part of our audit and are consistent with the prior year. If we had identified any significant uncorrected or corrected misstatements, I would have brought that to the Committee on Audit and to the board, but this year we did not have any adjustments or misstatements to identify to you. Finally, just wanted to spend a couple minutes on the remediation efforts. As alluded to before, there was a significant deficiency last year related to the data that's used to prepare the OPEB liabilities. Management put significant effort into coming up with reconciliation procedures, doing a deep dive into the data. The CalPERS is the one that actually calculates the liability, but it's based on the information that is provided first from the CSU, then to the State Controller's Office, and then to CalPERS, and then that information is scrubbed. So there's lots of moving pieces, and the efforts that management put in place this year were sufficient to be able to remove that significant deficiency, and we didn't have an adjustment related to that matter this year as well. The other thing that we're engaged to audit is the single audit. Because the California State University system receives federal funds, when you do that, you have to have a single audit every year. The single audit is very prescriptive in nature. There's specific things that have to be looked at. There's risk assessments that are performed, and then based on that analysis, you determine which programs you have to audit. This year, the CSU expended $2.85 billion of federal funds. And just to kind of put it in perspective, 90% of that relates to student financial aid funds. So The student financial aid cluster was identified as a major program this year and was audited. The non-financial aid program that was audited was the CARES Act funding, as Mary had alluded to. We did not have any exceptions noted to the CARES Act funding. A couple of findings were identified, which were referenced before, one related to enrollment reporting, one related to disbursements. But because of the level that you of the bar that you have to meet for those specific findings, they had to be reported again. They are reporting in nature, and those findings did not impact our opinion on the system's compliance with the federal guidelines. And we issued unmodified opinions over compliance for both major programs that were identified this year. With that, I'd be happy to open it up for answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you again, Mary and Steve, and all of the team, others on your teams who've been working with you as well, along with Vlad and his team, and across the campuses. It's a huge effort, as you just heard, and it's just a phenomenal accomplishment to be able to report out an unmodified opinion and a clean audit, essentially. I know I see my former chair of audit, Trustee Taylor, has his hand up, so I'll recognize him first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Help me understand the material weaknesses of our internal controls. Not a small issue at the foundations or our auxiliaries. What is the timeline for remediating those, and when can the committee expect to report back on the progress made in that regard?
So for the auxiliaries, we normally require their corrective action reports in about this first quarter of the year, by the first quarter of the year. We then go through a process where my team checks it. It also goes over to Vlad's team in internal audit to go through, what the plan is to make sure it's a sound plan. And then we look for the auxiliaries to implement that plan through their board of directors. And so we normally will check back then in the next audit cycle to make sure that those things are either in process or were effective to remediate the problems. So that's kind of the overall cycle. For the auxiliary.
Get a year to solve these things?
Well, it's not normally a year. It just, the process just, by the time we get everybody reviewing and okaying the procedure that normally the auxiliaries have already implemented, by the time we get to the end of all that. We normally don't come back to the board with the auxiliary items. We can, if that makes sense. So that's kind of
well, again, material weakness is not a significant deficiency, right? And particularly when it comes to internal controls. It just is something that tells me it's risen to a level where it's not minor. So I would encourage, some kind of report before next March that says, yes, these have been taken care of. And if they haven't, then, that opens up a whole nother set of questions.
Right.
I think it'd be great if at the minimum we can have a report back to our future audit committee on the status update. I'm sure Vlad and the team can join with Mary in doing that.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Any other hands or questions or comments? Again, this is an information item. I know your eyes can bleed when you read this report, but it has a ton of very helpful information. One takeaway, I think, for the public to know, that one slide, Mary, about our net position, it's a pretty common measuring stick for companies and public agencies, if not for the post-employment benefits of 22 some $billion, which really is the state's obligation around 95%. Vlad has just told me we would be in quite a healthy, positive net position. So I think that's an important reminder for everyone who's listening to be aware. But I'm not seeing any other questions or hands raised. And if there are not, Madam Chair, I will wrap up the Committee on Audit since this is an information item, and I will conclude our business here and hand it back to you.
Thank you, Trustee Day. We're now going to take a brief lunch and reconvene afterwards. Let's meet back by noon. Thank you.